cut from aged care when it's in the budget papers, denying more Australians are out of work because he excluded them from JobKeeper, pretending robo-debt wasn't his policy, wrongly claiming Kevin Rudd had travelled overseas, and denying his role in sports rorts in spite of the colour-coded map.
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Under the policies of this government, Mr Speaker, as Australia has faced its greatest economic challenge since the Great Depression, Mr Speaker, 700,000 Australians, 700,000 Australians
Member for Shortland
avoided losing their jobs because of the quick and the timely and the well-targeted support that was brought together by this government, Mr Speaker. That changed the landscape, economic and otherwise, Mr Speaker, for Australians during this crisis, Mr Speaker. 700,000 Australians would have otherwise lost their job. Mr Speaker, on top of that, as a result of those important supports, we have seen some 80% of the jobs that were lost through the COVID-19 crisis, jobs that were reduced to 0 hours, come back over the course of these many months. Mr Speaker, not only that, but the actions of the government have ensured working together with state and territory premiers and chief ministers, coming together in the National Cabinet, which will meet for the last time this year, Mr Speaker, tomorrow, here in Canberra, working together to keep Australians safe, which provided the platform for the economic recovery that is occurring. Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition might not know what's going on in Australia, Mr Speaker, but this government does, and that's why we've provided the support that we have. But, Mr Speaker, the people we must thank most for Australia coming through this crisis, Mr Speaker, are all of those Australians who have quietly gone about their business, helping each other to get Australia through. Mr Speaker, angry remonstrations by the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, betray only one thing, that the only job that he is worried about, Mr Speaker, is the one that those behind him are seeking to take off him.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister inform the House about how everyday Australians have done what they do best as they stepped up and came together in a united national effort to get us through one of our most challenging years, and how the Morrison government both thanks and supports them as we look ahead to 2021.
The Prime Minister has the call. The member for Sydney.
Mr Speaker. In 2020, Mr Speaker, I have never been more proud of this country than I am today as we go towards the end of this year, Mr Speaker, and I have never been more thankful to my fellow Australians for the effort, Mr Speaker, that they have put in, quietly going about, not seeking thanks, Mr Speaker, but looking after their fellow Australians. Mr Speaker, I don't understand the interjections from those officers because I would assume that they would share these sentiments as we express thanks to the people of Australia. Mr Speaker, this year, in my Christmas card, there are 8 names, Mr Speaker. There are 8 Australians who I want to thank. Garen Lowe, because they represent that united national effort. Garen Lowe is the Broadway Coles popular greeter. Those who have visited the Coles store there would have seen his cheery smile, and he's kept people safe in that shop over the course of COVID-19. Annette Kuipers, Mr Speaker, is a hospital cleaner from St Helens in Tasmania, giving an encouragement and care for the sick. Nathan Watts, Mr Speaker, from the CFS in South Australia, was the one joining with so many others at the Adelaide Hills and on Kangaroo Island through the Black Summer fires. Queensland teacher, Mr Speaker,
Prime Minister will pause
Lisa
for a
Bates.
second. The member for Shortland's been warned. He continues to interject, so he'll leave under 94A. Member for Brand can join him if she wishes to, and the member for Dunkley is warned as well. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Queensland teacher Lisa Bates. She kept her Year 6 students learning throughout the course of COVID-19 when they had to go to remote learning.
Sorry, Prime Minister. I said to the member for Dunkley she could if she wanted to. It seems she's walked, but that's okay. Member for Brand, sorry, but that's okay. Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Private Frank Marra, a proud Indigenous Australian, Mr Speaker, who answered the call on both Operation COVID Assist and Bushfire Assist. Von Harrington, Mr Speaker, from Canberra. She called those as a volunteer who were in isolation to let her fellow Australians know that while being in isolation, they were not alone. And then there's 10-year-old Darcy Hetherington making face masks in regional Victoria. Mr Speaker, it says on the front of the card, grateful, joyful and hopeful. We can look forward to 2021 with hope because of the extraordinary work of Australians over the course of this year. Mr Speaker, we can look to this Christmas season and seek out the joy that is available there as we come together in our families and with fellow Australians. And for some Australians, Mr Speaker, that will be more difficult because Christmas can be a very difficult time of the year, particularly when for many there will be one less place at the table, Mr Speaker. But I would ask all of us here in this place, Mr Speaker, joining the House, to thank Australia. To thank Australians, Mr Speaker. This has been a united national effort of so many Australians quietly going about their business to ensure that this country is amongst a handful of nations in the world to be able to come through this terrible crisis. As a Prime Minister, I'm deeply grateful to the people of Australia.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question's to the Prime Minister, and I ask, will the Prime Minister back down on the cut to take-home pay that he claims he hasn't made?
The Minister for Industrial Relations. The Minister for Industrial Relations has the call. No, that's okay. Minister for Industrial Relations, perhaps resume your seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order needs to state what the point of order is.
My point of order is regarding the standing orders that allow the Prime Minister to have someone answer questions on his behalf that's allowed. But it can't be allowed with just a contemptuous nod of the head. It's got to be referred, and the Parliament deserves to be treated with respect.
Members on my right. In response to the point of order, I'm just going to point out a couple of things to the Leader of the Opposition. I'm not going to take the House to the page of practice that makes clear the very long history of the Prime Minister being able to refer questions to any minister. And I'm not going to take him to the page on practice where it says how that should be done, because it doesn't say so. And there's been a long history of Prime Ministers not coming to the microphone and referring the question away. That's certainly been the case. It's something I'm happy to look at. This is the last day of this year, but it must have, it's certainly he's not the first Prime Minister to look to a minister and ask for them to answer the question. No, that's the end of it. We're now going to the answer, and the Minister for Industrial Relations has the call.
Yes, and the double negative question was, will the PM back down on something which the government has not done? No, we won't, because we haven't done it, and therefore there's nothing to back down on. I mean, the question really, Mr Speaker, is why are the members for Watson and Grainler on their motorcycles seeing who can jump the biggest shark? What is going on there? Like, why are they engaged in a...
resume his seat. The member for Griffith. The member for Barton. I wouldn't be talking about lucky to be here. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
On direct relevance, it's not open to ministers to reframe the question as they would like to have it asked.
And in response, I'll say it's not open to questioners to demand they answer it in a certain way. I mean, it was a specific question, but it's a question that had at its heart an allegation, and the minister answering is quite entitled to rebut an allegation in a question. The minister has the call.
Reject the allegation wholeheartedly. And there they are in the motorcycle, broom, broom. Both of them getting ready to jump the biggest shark that they can find. Why are they both trying so hard to out-overreach each other.
The minister will resume his seat. I'm going to caution the member for McEwen for his earlier interjection. It is disorderly to start comparing anyone in this House to some fictional character. And I'll say to the member for McEwen, it's dangerous territory for him. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. And it goes to accuracy because
no,
there are
there's
kids
no
listening.
point of order. The
A
Leader of the
motorbike
Opposition
can't
will
jump
resume
the
his
shark.
seat. Your microphone's off. The Minister for Industrial Relations.
We'll explain to the Leader of the Opposition what the phrase jumping the shark means after question time. But why are they both trying to out-overreach each other? Like, why are they both trying to come out with the most absurd, ridiculous untruth in a question that they possibly can? Because it's the final audition for the one job that they both want, and that's the person sitting over there. They both want and envy that job, and that's why we are getting this ridiculous overreach.
The member for COWPER.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison-McCormack government recognises and thanks Australia's supply chain workers and businesses who have helped our nation get through one of its most challenging years?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for COWPER for his question. Regional Australia is at the heart of our nation. No more so than this year, Mr Speaker. They have been magnificent throughout this global pandemic, which has caused such heartache throughout the world. Regional Australia has been there for us, each and every one of us. It has maintained its strength, and we say thank you to those people in regional Australia for their determination, for their fortitude, for their mateship. Our regions upheld restrictions even in instances where there were no cases in their communities. We have relied upon our regions to lead the way through the response to COVID-19. And I take this opportunity to thank each and every Australian, not just those in the regions, but each and every Aussie, particularly those in country and coastal communities, for persevering in what has been a remarkably challenging year. Thank you to the truckies who've kept supermarket shelves stocked and delivered critical medical supplies across state borders. Thank you to the aviation sector, which was hit first and hit hardest at the very beginning of the pandemic. Planes in the air equals jobs on the ground. And with the easing of restrictions nationwide, we look forward to seeing a resurgence of air travel in the weeks leading up to Christmas so loved ones can be reunited at this special time. Thank you to our farmers, our fantastic farmers who have continued to produce the world's best food and fibre. Thanks to the overseas labour force, currently working hard in Australian orchards and meatworks and elsewhere, and those who will follow from the Pacific and other nations next year, hopefully in a trans-Tasman bubble. Thank you to the many hard-working people who've continued to work to ensure the delivery of essential community infrastructure in construction, planning, project management, in manufacturing supply. Thank you to our frontline workers, our teachers, our healthcare workers, our first responders for your commitment, your dedication above the call of duty. Thank you to the small business owners, particularly those in regional Australia who have adapted, who have diversified and who have persevered to keep their doors open and stay connected with their workers, stayed connected with their employees. We owe them a debt of gratitude. Together we have weathered the immense challenges brought about by COVID-19, and we've done it together. And I say this Christmas, this summer, think local, shop local, buy local. Please buy Australian. Buy Australian produce. It is so essential, and we have the very best in all of the world on our shelves. Look for that Australian logo. Please buy it. Help an Australian farmer. Help somebody from regional Australia. So important. Together we will recover. United, stronger, stoic, together.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Just briefly, Mr Speaker, I associate Labor with the fine words of the Deputy Prime Minister with regard to a shout-out for all those in the regions who have looked after us during this difficult year.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. I refer to the former Finance Minister's statement that low wages are a deliberate design feature of our economic architecture. Will the Prime Minister admit his new workplace laws are part of his deliberate scheme to cut take-home pay?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. So, the system that we envisage and wish to see operating effectively in Australia, let me describe the model of industrial relations that we are working towards. It's a model which places primary emphasis on bargaining at the workplace level within a framework of minimum standards provided by arbitral tribunals. It's a model under which compulsory arbitrated awards and arbitrated wage increases would be there as a safety net. The safety net would not be intended to prescribe the actual conditions of work that most employees have, but only those unable to make workplace agreements with employers. Over time, the safety net would inevitably become simpler. We would have fewer awards with fewer clauses. For most employees and most businesses, wages and conditions of work would be determined by agreements worked out by the employer, the employees and their union. These agreements would predominantly be based on improving the productive performance of enterprises, because both employers and employees are coming to understand that only productivity improvements can guarantee sustainable real wage increases. Paul Keating, members. That was the original vision of the enterprise bargaining system, and that is the vision that we share with that former Prime Minister, because enterprise agreements, when they prevail over awards, result in workers being paid 40% more on average. That is the system that we need to revitalise, and that is the system, the subject of our bill, to make for a better Australia with more people in better paying jobs.
The member for Warringah.
To the Prime Minister, the 2020 UN Production Gap report has reported that the world is heading for a temperature rise in excess of 3 degrees on current emission reduction commitments. In response, leaders around the world are speaking at the COP26 Ambition Summit this Saturday to honour their commitment to act to stay within 1.5 degrees. Is it correct that as a result of your government's failure to commit to increase its ambitions and do what it takes to stay within 1.5 degrees, you're not invited to present at the COP26 Ambition Summit?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, I can assure you of this, that Australia's climate and energy policy will be set here in Australia's national interests, not to get a speaking slot at some international summit, Mr Speaker. The only approval I seek for the policies of my government, Mr Speaker, is the Australian people. That's it, Mr Speaker. That's it. The only people I answer to in this place, Mr Speaker, is the Australian people. And our government stands to serve the Australian people. Whatever country that may be, that may seek to impose whatever position on this country, Mr Speaker, Australia's policy will always remain sovereign within our borders and nowhere else, Mr Speaker. But what I can tell the member, and I'm sure she'd be pleased to know, that over the last 2 years, Australia's 2030 position, the Paris targets that we have committed to, has improved by 639 million tonnes, Mr Speaker. This is the equivalent to taking all of Australia's 14.7 million cars off the road for 15 years, Mr Speaker. Our emissions have fallen since 2005 by some 16.6%, Mr Speaker. Over 430 million tonnes.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat for a second. The member for Warringah on a point of order.
Relevance, Mr Speaker. The question is whether he's presenting at the Ambition
And as I've said many times before, if the member for Warringah had simply just asked that and only asked that, the Prime Minister would have been compelled to give a very specific answer. But unfortunately for her, she included a long preamble that made a number of statements about the subject matter, and that enables the Prime Minister to answer all aspects of what a member asks in their question and not confine him to the preferred aspect, which was the specific question at the end. The Prime Minister is in order.
Mr Speaker, but I do note the point of relevance that the member offered up just now. The member thinks what's relevant is whether you speak at summits or not. Mr Speaker, Mr Speaker, that is not something that troubles me or concerns me one way or the other. If people wishes to speak at them, we're happy to come. If they don't, I'm not fussed, Mr Speaker. What matters is if you actually reduce emissions. And the 16.6% fall in emissions that we've had since 2005, and since emissions peaked in 2007, almost 20% fall in emissions, Mr Speaker. But on the earlier figures, this compares to a 0 or 0 to 2% fall in like countries like Canada and New Zealand, Mr Speaker. Australia has record investment in renewables. Australia has a plan to put the technology in place to reduce emissions and ensure we achieve the Kyoto, as we already have, and demonstrated that, and importantly the Paris commitments before us, Mr Speaker. What matters is what you get done, and Australia is getting it done on emissions reduction. That's what matters to the Australian people, not how many speeches you give, Mr Speaker, not how much ambition you declare, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, I may have an ambition to play front row forward for the Australian Wallabies. But
members
Mr.
on
Speaker,
my left,
that
the member
ambition
for Eden
won't be
Monaro.
realised. But what is being realised, Mr Speaker, is Australia is meeting its emission reduction targets.
And I call the member for Ryan.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House how the Morrison government's economic support continues to help Australian families and businesses, and how grateful this government is for their courage and determination as we come back from the COVID-19 recession?
The Treasurer has the call.
Very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Ryan for his question and acknowledge his experience on Brisbane City Council before he came to this place, the biggest council across the country, Mr Speaker. And in the electorate of Ryan, there are more than 70,000 taxpayers who are getting tax relief as a result of the policies that we on this side of the House have supported and have legislated. Now, Mr Speaker, more than 5,000 businesses in the electorate of Ryan are benefiting from the JobKeeper program, a program which has been an economic lifeline for the workers across Australia. And the member for Ryan, like others on this side of the House, understand that Australia, through COVID-19, has faced the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression. 1.3 million Australians either lost their jobs or saw their working hours reduced to zero. We saw GDP growth fall by 7% in the June quarter, the biggest fall on record. But now the economic recovery is on, and Australia is seeing the jobs coming back. 80% of those 1.3 million Australians are now back at work. The effective unemployment rate has come down from 14.9 to 7.4%. There are 2 million fewer Australians on JobKeeper in the month of October compared to the month of September. Business and consumer confidence has now got back to its pre-pandemic highs, and we saw that GDP growth in the September quarter was 3.3%, the biggest quarterly jump in 40 years. Now, this economic recovery belongs to every Australian, Mr Speaker. Every Australian family and every Australian worker have delivered this result with the economic recovery now underway. And we are grateful to the small business owners and workers right across the country. Because the small business owners, they're the first in, they're the last out, they work the front office, they work the back office, and they have worked through this pandemic to find a way to get to the other side. And we give thanks to those small business owners and their workers right across the country. And also the lenders. The lenders have partnered with the prudential regulator and government, and what we have seen is that 900,000 plus loans have had their payments deferred. 900,000 plus loans have had their payments deferred, worth more than $250 billion. So this very much has been a Team Australia moment, a Team Australia effort where families, where workers, where businesses, big and small, have come together to ensure that Australia rebounds from this biggest economic shock since the Great Depression.
The member for Cooper.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. Yesterday, the Minister denied that a personal carer in aged care could lose up to $11,000 a year from their take-home pay under the government's legislation. Why won't the Minister acknowledge the truth, that if there's no better off test, then every penalty rate and shift allowance is at risk?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Because there is a better off test, and it remains in the legislation, as it was always designed to do. I think what the member is talking about is what's known as crisis provision that was inserted into the Fair Work Act by the Labor Party, section 189, and maybe I can share with the House some of the instances, very rare instances, that has been used in the past. In 2011, under the Labor then government, the Timaru Aboriginal Corporation needed to allow for extreme weather events and made an application agreed by all 19 of its employees to work their ordinary hours in a way not catered for in the award. And the Fair Work Commission agreed with the agreement amongst all the employees and the employer that that was a common sense change which was not contrary to the public interest and should be approved. And it was approved. And that seems to us to be a reasonable, limited response in a crisis circumstance. In another example, in 2011, a fresh produce business in Cairns. In 2010, after floods and Cyclone Yazi, and what had led in Cairns to what was described as the extreme weather event of the non-occurrence of winter and had impacted the production of fruit, had an agreement by all staff to work additional hours at ordinary rates. Again, the independent umpire, under the provision inserted into the Fair Work Act by Labor, made a determination that the application, agreed to by employees, agreed to by the employer, was not contrary to the public interest, which is the firm, clear, necessary safety net test there, and that agreement was agreed to. The idea that what you are suggesting would occur, either in the present system or the future, the idea that what the member is suggesting would occur either in the present system or in the very modest addition that we have suggested to section 189 is simply not correct.
The member for Chisholm.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister update the House on how our national health response to COVID-19 and in particular how the Morrison government recognises and thanks the remarkable work of our medical and healthcare workers who have kept Australians safe through 2020?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I particularly want to thank the member for Chisholm. Through much of the early part of the COVID pandemic, she was one of the great forces of community glue in this country, and she stood for Chinese Australians along with many others and provided that support, provided that rallying point, and I want to thank her for that. I want to acknowledge around the world we've now passed well over 68 million cases of COVID. We've passed over 1.56 million lives lost. In the last 24 hours, 640,000 cases and over 12,000 lives lost. In Australia, at the same time as we've seen 12,000 lives lost, 0 cases in ICU, 0 Australians with COVID-19 on ventilation and 0 cases across the country within the community. On that basis, we owe an enormous debt of gratitude and thanks to our health workers. On behalf of the government, on behalf of the parliament, on behalf of all Australians, I want to say my thanks to our amazing health and medical workers around the country. I particularly, as just an example, think of my own area, my own electorate, Peninsula Health. In particular, Tresna Cuttress, the nurse unit manager at Frankston Hospital, and I choose her because she's been an inspiring leader. Interestingly, It's a very similar role to the one my mother had in the same hospital half a century ago. And what Tresna has done, she received the first COVID patient into her ward in Peninsula Health. She helped train a team. She helped keep that team safe. She helped keep people on the peninsula safe. She led our nurses to perhaps, in my view, their highest moment since the Second World War. They have been amongst the finest of Australians at the greatest of need, and they have been extraordinary. Along with our doctors, Dr Peter Kelly, who has led the infectious diseases ward at Frankston Hospital and across Peninsula Health, has worked on infection control and has worked on that safety. The CEO, Felicity Top, but all of the nurses, all of the doctors, all of the orderlies and attendants, everybody within that facility. And across Australia, our pharmacists who stayed open, our pathologists who've been on the front line, or our specialists, our physios, our allied health workers. These are the Australians that have helped keep other Australians safe. This has been the hardest of years, but I believe it has been the finest of years. And above all else, we thank our health workers, our medical workers and our nurses.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Spence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that under his new laws, workplace laws, workers who stacked supermarket shelves 5 nights a week from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. could lose up to $5,500 a year? Why is the Prime Minister's Christmas thank you to frontline workers a cut in their take-home pay?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Well, Mr Speaker, with respect to the member for Spence's question, the scenario that he outlines is not possible and would not happen. Not now, not under what is being proposed by way of reform, not ever.
The member for Nichols.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industry, Science and Technology. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison-McCormack government recognises and thanks Australia's manufacturing industry for rising to the challenge of the COVID-19 pandemic, including by supplying critical medical items?
The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Nichols for his question and acknowledge that manufacturers in his regional electorate were some of the most vital in our response to COVID-19. In fact, one of the first manufacturers that I called back in February was Ray at Medcon in Shepparton. At the time, that great family business was the only manufacturer of surgical masks in the country. Now, working with us and aided by Defence Force engineers, Ray and his team set about increasing production to provide the masks that we needed. Now, with the help of Foodmac in nearby Echuca, which manufactured new machines, Medcon increased production from around 2 million masks a year to over 59 million. Now, many others have now joined that market too, and this year our nation will produce more than 400 million surgical masks. But it's not just the masks that we made. Grey Innovation and ResMed produced the ventilators that we needed. Many small and large distillers pivoted to produce hand sanitizer. Our food manufacturers worked around the clock to meet demand and keep our supermarket shelves stocked. And Mr Speaker, I thought I'd use this year's last question time to give an example that demonstrates how businesses in the supply chain benefit when we scale up production and take on innovative new projects. Now, one of the projects that we backed in April was a collaboration to produce emergency relief hospital beds led by medtech company Stryker South Pacific and 3 other Aussie businesses. Now, one of those businesses is Fallshaw Wheels and Casters, and they're a 100-year-old Melbourne-based family business. Now, from this collaboration, Fallshaw went on to supply casters to Stryker's international and local teams. They hired 6 new staff and moved to 2 production shifts in order to ship 2,000 casters a day to the United States. It's a great example of how traditional companies, through collaborations, can achieve scale and take their product to the world. And that's exactly what our $1.5 billion modern manufacturing strategy is all about. Mr. Speaker, the silver lining of this crisis has been that Australians have gained a deeper understanding of the vital role of our manufacturers, and there's been a renewed interest in buying Australian-made products. On behalf of a grateful nation, I thank our Aussie manufacturers for their massive contribution this year and for the role they will play in our comeback.
The member for Cowan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. Under the government's legislation, a cleaner working part-time could lose $6,600 a year from their take-home pay. Why is the Prime Minister punishing frontline workers with a cut to their take-home pay?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Question is, once again, untrue, incorrect. It wouldn't happen, it doesn't happen, and it wouldn't happen into the future. And I think, Member for Cowan...
Members on my left.
I think, Member for Cowan, that you and I would both agree that that scenario would never be considered to be in the public interest, which is the existing test, and it would be the preserved test, which is the reason why it doesn't happen now, and it's the reason why it would never happen into the future. And the question is, once again, desperately wrong for a desperate leader.
The member for Braddon.
The question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government recognises and thanks the incredible work of Australia's Defence Force personnel in helping our nation through one of our most challenging years?
The Minister representing the Minister for Defence.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the member for Braddon for his question, and as somebody who's worn the uniform of the Australian Defence Force, I'm sure he would want to join me, as I'm sure everybody in this House would, in wishing our defence personnel all the very best to them and their families this Christmas and New Year, and especially this year the veterans and their families for the sacrifice that they've made, in some cases the sacrifice that they still make today, either in their own lives or in the support of others, of their mates and their colleagues, and some of them have done it over many decades. They've advocated, they've provided support to loved ones, and they deserve great credit for it. Mr. Speaker, all Australians were proud when 8,200 defence personnel at the beginning of this year provided support through Bushfire Assist, which was an operation designed to help those Australians, obviously, that were in the darkest hour of need. And the Australian Defence Force keeps us safe, not just internationally when they're deployed, but here at home as well. And the depth and the breadth of their skill and expertise is a national treasure, and we really do recognise that today. I want to say thank you also to the defence personnel who have been involved in the government's response to COVID. Those defence personnel that have been posted up in the Torres Strait, those that have been providing support on our borders, those who have been providing support at our airports, at hotel quarantine, and those, Mr. Speaker, who have been providing support across the country otherwise to keep Australians healthy and safe. The men and women of the Australian Defence Force have carried out evacuations this year, they've set up shelters, they've transported emergency personnel, and they have done our country proud. More than 11,000 personnel have been deployed as part of Operation COVID-19 Assist, and they have the grateful thanks of our nation. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister for Industry pointed out before, there was a remarkable story that we were confronted with in the National Security Committee, where we needed to produce more masks, and we know that Defence engineers from the Land Engineer Agency and the Special Operations Logistics Squadron and Joint Logistics worked with that particular company to produce those masks, and they stepped up in a remarkable way, an operation that would normally take many months or years to retool and to adjust the settings at that factory. Our defence personnel worked day and night to make that happen because our country needed that of them. So, Mr. Speaker, the ADF is a pillar in our society. They do deserve our thanks, and to the personnel, both serving and retired, our defence veterans, their families, I thank them so much this Christmas for the work that they've done for our country during this 2020, our most difficult year in modern history.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition, just on indulgence.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I associate Labor with the words of the Minister representing the Minister for Defence? This has been an extraordinary year in which our sense of what defines a hero might have changed, and in terms of our health workers, they have worn a different uniform, but those who have worn our nation's uniform, as the Minister has said, in their thousands, have been providing assistance to Australians in so many different ways. And from the bushfires last summer through the COVID-19 crisis, in nursing homes, in the factory in Shepparton making surgical masks, on border controls, on phones doing case tracing, they've been doing it all. And certainly, as a nation, we are grateful to our Defence Forces always, but this year in particular, we owe them a debt of gratitude for a different role that they've played, but a role which is just as significant.
The member for Dobell.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Under the Prime Minister's new workplace laws, a pharmacy assistant working a 38-hour week could lose $6,000 a year. Why is the government's Christmas thank you to frontline workers a cut to their take-home pay?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
They simply could not, which really raises the question, why would the Leader of the Opposition be sending out his backbenchers to ask questions solely designed and unnecessarily to scare people before Christmas? Why would you do that? I mean, how desperate would you have to be? How desperate would you have to be to send out your backbenchers to ask questions based on totally false assertions and premises, totally false, completely wrong, raising impossible scenarios? How desperate would you have to be to do that when its only conceivable reason for having been done is to scare people unnecessarily, unfairly and untruthfully?
The member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is for the Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management. Will the Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government recognises and thanks Australians, and in particular our emergency responders, for stepping up to support their communities during this challenging period marked by drought, bushfires and pandemics?
The Minister for Agriculture.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Mallee for her question and acknowledge that this year Australia has faced up to some of its harshest challenges it has ever faced. But as a nation, we have come together and worked together. And in fact, it's not just our politicians, it's not just our civic leaders, it's been ordinary Australians doing extraordinary things, whether it be bushfires or whether it be drought. We have seen ordinary Australians stand up, and a perfect example of that is a young lady of the name of Grace Brennan, who has the quintessential bush story. A city girl going to visit a friend in the bush, meets a young bloke, falls in love and moves to the bush in the middle of the worst drought in our nation's history. And in the end, she sees the pain and heartache that her township of Warren is going through, and in essence goes to create a Buy from the Bush campaign, connecting bush businesses with city customers. And within 7 weeks, she has 130,000 Instagram followers and has increased rural postage by 30%. She gets, within 7 months, $5 million worth of revenue put through into regional communities, and 20% of those businesses employ a new person. 40% of those businesses then go on to trade and sell their wares interstate, 19% internationally. 96% of those businesses are in fact owned by women. This is a great idea from a lady that didn't retreat, didn't go back to the city, but stayed and helped her fellow Australians through some of the worst times that rural and regional Australia has found. This is something that an ordinary Australian stood up with her fellow Australians, shoulder to shoulder, in making sure that she created opportunities for her fellow people in Warren. And one of the businesses that signed up, a business, said, Buy from the Bush not only helped us financially, but it helped tell this real story of the drought.
We're not Aussie battlers with starving sheep that need charity. We are doers who need some patronage from our city cousins, and that's exactly what we got through Buy from the Bush. This is what I wrote the day after being featured in October 2019. Yesterday I processed 66 online sales. Normally I wouldn't make 66 online sales in a year. I sold $2,000 worth of greeting cards in a day. And although I'm exhausted, I'm over the moon. This morning I spent $160 at the post office. I bought myself breakfast at the cafe because I was feeling so rich, and with the orders still rolling in, I've decided to hire the local painter to paint my spare room, a job I've been wanting to do for ages, and to take the local window covering business up on their quote to build my new house. This is not just a story of survival, this is a story of thriving in regional and rural Australia. And to people, ordinary Australians, like Grace Brennan, to her and all those Australians that stand with their fellow Australians in their time of need, our nation says thank you.
The member for Newcastle.
Thank you, Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations. Under the Prime Minister's workplace laws, a cook working 6 a.m. to 2 p.m, 5 days a week, including weekends, could lose more than $6,000 a year. Workers like these have spent 2020 worried about their livelihoods. Why is the Prime Minister punishing them with a cut to their take-home pay?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Why is the member deliberately trying to scare them for no reason whatsoever? For no
Members
reason
on my
whatsoever.
left.
Why would they deserve that after the year that they have had? Why would the member do that? And again, the scenario that the member has raised just wouldn't happen. It doesn't happen now. It would not happen under any of the changes that we are suggesting before the parliament. It simply wouldn't happen. There are a range of protections to ensure that that scenario would never arise, a range of very strong protections. They start with the fact that any of these sort of applications has to commence with agreement between the parties. The union is the bargaining representative, the employees and the employer. And indeed, one of these questions was asked earlier by the member for Spence. And not that long ago, in March of 2017, the member for Spence said this: all of the workers on these enterprise bargaining agreements vote to either accept the agreement or reject the agreement. Now, what worker would vote for less pay and less conditions? Answer: no worker would. That was the member for Spence. And that is the beginning of the protections of the process. At the end of the protections of the process is the public interest test that exists in the relevant section, which says that the Fair Work Commission can never approve any agreement if it will be contrary to the public interest to do so. And I think the member and I would both agree, and all the members opposite would agree with all the members of the government, that the scenario that you've raised could never be reasonably considered to be in the public interest, which is why it could never happen.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Families and Social Services. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government recognises and thanks the incredible work of everyday Australians who have stepped up and offered critical volunteer support throughout this challenging year? And in his capacity as the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, will he please update the House on the tireless work of Australians involved in the NDIS who have assisted us through 2020?
The Minister representing the Minister for Families and Social Services.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for all of her hard community work, especially in the area of raising the issue of endometriosis, in line with members for Barara and Forrest and many members in this chamber who've stood up for important issues. In this country, Mr Speaker, there is and has always been enormous need, and when there's need, there's volunteers. And 2020 has been a year of extraordinary need. Drought, fires, floods, pestilence and pandemic. And Australians have stood up to this, delivering food hampers, checking on neighbours, lifeline calls, lifting communities, encouraging, cooking, delivering, supporting. And to all of these fabulous Australians, I think we all collectively say thank you to them. And there are people like 20-year-old Alex. Alex, who was concerned about his sister, a doctor, skipping meals as her workload skyrocketed. Alex began to batch cook lasagna for her. Alex put an offer for help on Facebook and within a short time had 10 others helping him to literally pump out 300 free meals across the Melbourne Metropolitan Hospital system I reckon we can all say thanks to Alex for that. There are people like South Australian farmers Meg and Ollie Clothier. They've dedicated 2020 to caretaking properties so drought-affected farmers can get a much-needed break. And the couple have clocked up 35,000 kilometres in this pursuit, and I reckon this House can say thank you to Meg and Ollie for that sort of work. There are people like the Lions Club of Mount Gambier who provided firewood and a heap of encouragement to South Australian Police and Defence Force personnel as overnight temperatures plunged at lonely checkpoints, and I reckon we can collectively shout out to the Lions Club for that. There are people like Stephen, an NDIS participant, who volunteered his sewing skills to make pouches for orphan wildlife out of donated and discount fabric, and his mum Mary made sure that these pouches went all over Australia, and I reckon we can say to Stephen and Mary, thank you for what you've done. There's people like Shane. Shane's an NDIS participant whose manufacturing company released a new line of water-based hand sanitisers to address a very real hidden challenge of how do you maintain hand hygiene when you're manually using a wheelchair. His company has just launched a whole new range of Australian-made wheelchair-accessible sanitiser stations, and I reckon as a House we can do a big shout-out to Shane for his work helping people with wheelchairs. There are people like Volunteering ACT right here in Canberra whose members have supported some of our community's most vulnerable during the bushfire recovery, and I reckon we can shout out to Volunteering ACT for all of that great hard work. Mr Speaker, it's been a tough year, but Australians are a resilient lot. They've stood up, they've helped those in need, and I think collectively we can say thank you.
Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Industrial Relations, and I refer to the report in the Fin Review, Porter Retreats in Union Brawl, that the provision to cut take-home pay was included at, and I quote, the last minute, and after the negotiations between business unions and the government had concluded. Why didn't the government ever raise this proposal with unions before including it in the legislation tabled yesterday? And what exactly are you retreating from if there's no problem?
The Minister for Industrial Relations.
Well, again, the premise of the question is completely incorrect. And the idea and the proposition and the assertion that we've had question after question, that there is anything in what is being proposed that will result in the type of reduction that the Leader of the Opposition suggests is just absolutely wrong. It is completely wrong, Mr Speaker. And the protections that exist in the Act presently that Labor inserted are precisely, word for word, the protections that we have suggested should remain in the legislation that is now before the Parliament.
Is warned.
Absolutely word for word. And when you go to the relevant provisions, the protections that would absolutely and in all circumstances prevent happening what the Leader of the Opposition wrongfully says would happen are these. And these are the words, Mr Speaker. These are the words. You could never have the approval of agreement unless, quote, the approval of the agreement would not be contrary to the public interest. That is the protective lines inserted by Labor, and here are those that are replicated in the reforms before the Parliament. These are the exact same words. The approval of the agreement would not be contrary to the public interest. This is desperate, Mr Speaker. Absolutely desperate. Tell untruths, try and scare people, the signs of absolute desperation. Mr Speaker, if Yoda were here, he would remind us, he would remind us that fear of leadership tensions leads to the dark side, Mr Speaker. Fear of leadership tensions leads to the dark side. Leadership fear leads to anger. Anger leads to wildly untrue assertions in question time. That is the path to the dark side of politics, Mr Speaker, and that's the path that this Leader of the Opposition is on.
Members on both sides. The member for COWPER. The member for Barara has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government recognises and thanks the remarkable efforts of Australia's childcare workers and teachers in helping our nation get through 2020? And will the Minister also outline to the House the incredible resilience shown by our students, and in particular our Year 12 students, in making it through this year?
The Minister for Education. Members on my left. The Minister has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for his question, and can I thank him also for his dedication to the schools, the childcare centres in his electorate, and for his passion for education. Mr Speaker, this year has been a year like no other for those in the childcare sector. At the heart of the pandemic, those early childhood educators were called on to provide care for those essential workers' children, for those vulnerable children, and they fronted up day after day to make sure that that care could be provided. There was a lot of uncertainty, there was a lot of fear about what was happening with the coronavirus, what was happening through the pandemic, yet those early childhood workers, those educators, turned up and made sure that those children were cared for and they were looked after. And on behalf of every member of this House, I say thank you to those early childhood educators who did that work. When it came to our schools, we also need to thank our principals and our teachers for the work they've done this year. And I recognise the member for Gilmore when the pair of us went down to her electorate, to that school in BRADDON, which had been impacted by fires. That's often forgotten now, but Darren McPartland was there, making sure that he provided those protections and to those children who had been impacted by it. And I thank the member for Gilmore for having me to her electorate, and it's something that I will never forget, that session we had with those students that have been impacted by those fires. And then, of course, there was the coronavirus that came, and can I say to all the state and territory education ministers, thank you for coming together and making sure that we could provide that certainty for Year 12 students when it came to their ATARs. Incredibly important decisions.
Member for Sydney.
Incredibly important decisions that were made to give certainty to those Year 12 students, and the way we were able to come together as education ministers right across the nation to do that was incredibly important. And then can I say to those Year 12 students who have been through a year like no other, who had all their dreams of what a year would look like turned upside down, the resilience that you have shown, your commitment to continue to work through this and make sure that you got through this year was second to none. And although schoolies mightn't have been the same, although the end of the year mightn't have been the same, what you've done is quite extraordinary and will stand you in good stead. And can I say to all those Year 12 students, I'm sure I say this on behalf of all the House, very good luck with your results at the end of this year,
Minister's time has concluded, and I call the member for Ballarat.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why does the Prime Minister and the government constantly make big announcements without delivering them, including spending $6.8 billion less on infrastructure than in the budget papers, announcing the National Water Infrastructure Loan Facility in 50 media releases, then scrapping it, announcing the Urban Congestion Fund but delivering only $1 in $5, and spending nothing from the $4 billion Emergency Response Fund on bushfire-devastated communities?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We have seen this all day from the opposition, Mr Speaker. They have saved their worst for last today, Mr Speaker. They've saved their worst for last. Here, as a government, Mr Speaker, we have come together and we have been thanking Australians for their tremendous efforts this year, and we continue to do that in this place. And I want to thank all those who are out there, Mr Speaker, building the more than $100 billion of infrastructure that this government is committed to over the next 10 years, Mr Speaker. Projects like the Western Sydney International Airport in particular. Mr Speaker, this project is going to change not just New South Wales and Sydney, Mr Speaker, but it is going to change the entire nation. When we came to government, Mr Speaker, in 2013, I had sat on the opposition benches for 6 years. And over those 6 years, I heard the Leader of the Opposition go on and on and on and on about Western Sydney International Airport, Mr Speaker. He didn't turn a sod, Mr Speaker. He didn't even get up a sign, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition, when it comes to the Western Sydney International Airport,
Members
Mr.
on my left.
Speaker,
The
Mr.
member for
Speaker,
Greenway and
he
Bruce.
didn't do anything, despite the pleas, Mr Speaker, of those in his electorate, and despite everything he said he needed to do on Western Sydney International Airport. He was Transport Minister for 6 years. Mr Speaker, he couldn't get a runway, he couldn't get lift-off, Mr Speaker. He couldn't even get himself out there to actually make the project happen. So, Mr Speaker, I'm not going to take a lecture from the Labor Party, Mr Speaker, when this government has been delivering the jobs on the ground, that 1.5 million jobs that were created, Mr Speaker, before we came into the COVID-19 recession, saving 700,000 jobs. 700,000 jobs through the economic supports we put in place during the COVID-19 pandemic. Mr Speaker, the Australian people know because they have seen this government get on with the job. They've seen us deliver on the ground, Mr Speaker, and this desperate Leader of the Opposition can crow and carry on all he likes, Mr Speaker, but the Australian people have worked him out, and those behind him, Mr Speaker, have worked him out.
The member for Lyne.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. My question is to the Minister representing the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison-McCormack government recognises and thanks Australia's export sector for rising to the challenge to help their fellow Australians get through what has been a very challenging year?
The Minister representing the Minister for Trade and Investment.
I thank the member for Lyne. As he and all members know, it has been an extraordinarily difficult year. We've had drought, we've had flood, we've had bushfires, and we've had the devastation of COVID-19. And we all remember those terrible days of March and April when our meat and our fruit and veg and many other essential items were literally flying off our supermarket shelves. And at that time, Fiona Simpson, who is the President of the National Farmers Federation, she urged Australians to be calm because farmers had their backs, and she was right. They had our backs then, and they've got our backs now. And so today we thank our farmers, we thank our orchardists, we thank our exporters for all of the wonderful work that they did and continue to do for our country. Around Wellington in the Central West, they're talking about the best season for 40 years. Around Dubbo and through to the Macquarie Valley, they're talking about a bumper harvest, perhaps the biggest on record. And have a look at what's happening in the member for Lyne's electorate. There you will find Macca's, which is a fourth-generation family-owned meat producer that operates a number of properties from Saltash through to Gloucester. This year they have opened up 10 new export markets, including Japan, Korea, Singapore and the Philippines. So well done, Macca's. Have a look at what's happening in my own patch, in my own neck of the woods, around the Central West. This week we've got Central West cherries winging their way to Vietnam from Carnarvon orchards and many others around this area, helped by the federal government through the International Freight Assistance Mechanism, our $669 million program that supported over 8,000 flights and over $3.3 billion of high-quality Australian produce to leave our shores and support our primary producers and farmers. And we know how important it is because 1 in 5 jobs in Australia is supported by trade, 1 in 4 jobs in regional Australia, and of course we've just recorded our 34th consecutive month of trade surpluses. And this government, on this side of the House, we're supporting our primary producers and exporters. We've concluded 8 free trade agreements. We're working on the EU trade agreement. We are working on the UK trade agreement. So today we thank our exporters, our orchardists and our farmers. And as the Deputy Prime Minister said, let's support them this Christmas. All Australians can support them by putting more lamb and snags on the barbie this Christmas, by serving our wonderful Australian wine at Christmas time, by putting local cherries on the table at Christmas time. Lord knows we've got plenty in our office. Or you can put out a bottle of Aussie port for Santa on Christmas Eve. Mr Speaker, our farmers and exporters have had our backs and we've got theirs on this side of the house.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister agree that his 8-year-old government is riddled with waste and scandal, including spending $30 million on airport land that was worth only $3 million to a Liberal Party donor, $100 million on sports rorts, $4.5 billion to fix the second-rate COPPER NBN, $1.2 billion to compensate robo-debt victims, $20,000 on Cartier watches and millions on his dud COVID Safe app?
The Prime Minister has the call.
No, Mr Speaker.
The member for Fairfax has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and my question
The member will
goes
pause.
to the Minister.
The member for Dunkley will leave under Standing Order 94A. She was warned earlier. The member for Bruce can join her. And the member for Fairfax has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question goes to the Minister for International Development and the Pacific. Will the Minister please outline to the House how the Morrison government recognises and thanks the efforts of our Pacific partners and the Australians who have assisted them to get through this most challenging of years?
The Minister for International Development.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Fairfax for that question. I do want to counsel the opposition, don't knock number 11. Australia's got some great number 11 batters. Glenn McGrath got 61 against New Zealand once. I do want to say, number 11 questioners are very important. I do want to say to the member for Fairfax and join with him with his experience in agriculture in welcoming our Pacific family and the work they've done through this pandemic, one of the most difficult years in 100 years for the globe, and yet Australia and our region, our family and our friends in this region have actually come out better than every other single region in the world today. Notwithstanding the challenges we've faced, notwithstanding the difficulties that we've had, together as partners, as friends, we want to join all Australians in thanking our Pacific family for what they've done to protect themselves and protect our region and the cooperation we've had. And I do want to start by highlighting again for the House that 12 out of the 15 countries in the world that remain COVID-free are in our region. It's because of the decisions that our partner countries took early in this pandemic, like Australia, to protect themselves, to protect each other. I want to thank every Australian who's worked here but also abroad in our Pacific partner countries to help our partners through this. Many countries, understandably, in a difficult time, in an uncertain pandemic, made a difficult decision to withdraw their consular staff. Many non-NGOs had to withdraw their people out of countries in our region. But this government, under the leadership of the Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister and ourselves, we made the decision to keep our consular staff in place throughout the whole pandemic. And we thank every single member of that consular staff in every single country that turned up every day and did everything they could to help other people and help them get through it. I want to join the Acting Minister for Defence in what he said. Our defence personnel kept and stayed in our region as well, working hard to help people get through this. I want to thank the aid and development sector, the Australian aid, our partners who deliver these great programs all through our region, for staying in place in a very uncertain time, for continuing to deliver those essential programs. And, Mr Speaker, I also want to thank again, and the Minister for Health highlighted this earlier in the week, when he came out to my electorate and visited ResMed, 1,500 workers of ResMed on the floor that we had the great fortune to address, and the Minister for Health spoke to them to say thank you, because ResMed, an Australian start-up company, which is now a great global company, an advanced manufacturing company in Australia, they took great pride in what they did for the Australian government in producing ventilators, in producing PPE and producing masks. But I can tell this House, and everyone here will join me with this sentiment, those 1,500 workers in ResMed took the greatest pride in the fact that they had produced masks and PPE to help other countries in our region as well. The pride, literally, they beamed with pride. because of the work they've done to help other people in this Pacific. And that's the Australian spirit, Mr Speaker. We help ourselves, but we help others as well.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper. If I could add to an earlier answer, Mr Speaker.
Yes.
I needed to also acknowledge Regina Crouch from Western Australia. She's an aged care nurse, Mr Speaker. She travelled 3,000 kilometres to Victoria to help in the aged care response in that state during the course of the second wave of the pandemic, and she's also acknowledged, and I'm happy to table our best wishes to Australia, Mr Speaker.
I thank the Prime Minister. Earlier in the week, the member for Lingiari indicated he wished to speak on indulgence now, and I give the call to the member for Lingiari.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, last night we saw a very successful collaboration across the parliament to ensure 2 seats for the Northern Territory in the future. And I want to thank the